One brief sentence. That is all Genesis gives you. A single cryptic mention dropped into the narrative right before the story of Noah, as if nothing unusual had just been said. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. One sentence. No explanation of who they were. No breakdown of where they came from. No explicit details on what happened to them. The text plants them firmly in the narrative between two massive eras, gives them a single line, and then the flood comes and sweeps the story forward. But those few words have generated more intense debate, more speculation, and more theological controversy than almost any other passage in the Hebrew Bible. Because sitting underneath them, in the ancient Jewish texts discovered in desert caves, in the books that did not make it into the final biblical canon, and in the broader narrative of the entire Old Testament, is a story that the Bible never fully tells in one single place. It is a story about beings that were neither fully human nor fully divine. It is about forbidden knowledge handed down from heaven to earth. It is about giants who walked through Canaan while Israel was still enslaved in Egypt. And ultimately, it is about what happened to every last one of them, and why their destruction was the central focus of ancient history. To understand the mystery, we have to look directly at Genesis 6:1-4. When human beings began to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they took as wives any they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of humans, who bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. 3 questions have consumed scholars for 2,000 years. Who are the sons of God? Who are the Nephilim? And what is the connection between them? The Hebrew phrase used for sons of God is B'nai Elohim. In virtually every other place, this exact phrase appears in the Old Testament, such as the Book of Job. It refers unambiguously to divine beings, members of the heavenly court, not humans, beings from the divine realm. The linguistic origin of the word Nephilim itself reveals a fascinating divide. Traditionally, it was linked to the Hebrew root nephal, meaning to fall, popularized as the fallen ones. However, Aramaic and Hebrew scholarship points out that in the pre-flood Near Eastern context, the word likely stems from the Aramaic root nephil, which directly translates to giant. Across centuries of study, 3 major interpretations have emerged to explain this event. The first and oldest interpretation, held by ancient Jewish scholars, confirmed by the Dead Sea Scrolls, and endorsed by early Christian writers, is the angelic view. It states that the B'nai Elohim were divine beings who crossed the boundary between heaven and earth, took human women, and produced hybrid offspring, the Nephilim. The second interpretation, championed later by Augustine, is the Sethite view. This argues that the sons of God were the righteous descendants of Seth, Adam's 3rd son, while the daughters of men were the ungodly line of Cain. This sidesteps the uncomfortable concept of angels reproducing with humans, but it requires translating a divine title as ordinary men. The third interpretation, the dynastic view, identifies the sons of God as tyrannical ancient kings who claim divine status for themselves and abuse their power by taking women for their harems. While these views clash on the identity of the actors, they all agree on one thing. Whatever happened in Genesis 6 was deeply, fundamentally wrong. It contributed directly to the moral catastrophe that made the global flood necessary. And it produced something the earth was never meant to see. This is where an ancient Jewish document known as the Book of Enoch enters the picture, completely expanding the scale of what Genesis compresses into a single sentence. The Book of Enoch is not in the modern Western biblical canon, though it remains canonical in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Crucially, fragments of 11 separate Aramaic manuscripts of Enoch were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, proving its widespread circulation among Jewish communities around the time of the New Testament. Enoch details a rebellion of 200 divine beings called the Watchers, led by a figure named Samyaza. According to the text, they gathered on the summit of Mount Hermon, a massive peak still standing today at over 9,200 feet on the border of Syria and Lebanon, and bound themselves to an oath to carry out their plan. They descended into the human realm. They didn't just father the hybrid Nephilim, they introduced destabilizing, forbidden knowledge to humanity. A watcher named Azazel taught men how to forge metallurgy into weapons of war and armor. Others taught astrology, sorcery, cosmetics, and the cutting of roots. It was technology and knowledge that accelerated human capability far beyond what the moral framework of the time could safely contain. The text describes these giant offspring as ravenous. consuming the earth's resources so rapidly that human agriculture collapsed under their weight. When the food ran out, they turned on human populations and, eventually, on each other. The earth became soaked in blood, prompting the divine intervention of the flood. But this leaves us with a massive narrative paradox. The text of Genesis 6 explicitly states that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. After what? The flood came. Every living thing on the surface of the earth was destroyed. Noah and his family alone survived. How could a lineage of giants reappear after a cataclysm meant to wipe them out? The answer surfaces in Numbers chapter 13, when Moses sends 12 Israelite spies into the land of Canaan. They return with a terrifying report. We saw the Nephilim there, the Anakim, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes. And so we seemed to them. The presence of these giant lineages in Canaan is the exact reason 10 of the 12 spies panic, causing a 40-year delay of the Israelite conquest. How did they get there? Rather than imagining survivors swimming the floodwaters, scholarship pointing to the narrative logic of the ancient Near East suggests a simpler text-based answer, a second eruption. The phrase, "and also afterward," when the sons of God came into the daughters of humans, implies that a separate, localized crossing of the heavenly boundary occurred after the flood, concentrated heavily in the land of Canaan. The historical books of the Old Testament document these post-flood giant populations with highly specific names, locations, and physical dimensions. They were real, formidable populations that real ancient armies had to confront. In Deuteronomy 3, Moses confronts Og, described as the last of the Rephaim, a collective term for these giant people groups. The text records a highly specific detail to illustrate his scale. His iron bed measured 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. At the standard ancient cubit of 18 inches, that is a bed 13.5 feet long and 6 feet wide. Moses defeated Og in a massive battle at Edrei, a victory so significant it was sung about in Israelite history for generations. Centuries later, in 1 Samuel 17, we meet Goliath. The traditional Masoretic text lists his height at 6 cubits and a span, roughly 9 feet, 9 inches tall. Interestingly, early manuscripts like the Septuagint and Dead Sea Scroll fragments list him at 4 cubits and a span, about 6 feet, 9 inches. Even at the lower metric, he was an imposing, anomalous warrior. Crucially, the text notes Goliath came from Gath, Joshua 11:21-22 records, that centuries prior, Joshua had systematically wiped out the giant Anakim from the hill country, but a remnant survived in 3 Philistine cities, Gaza, Ashdod, and Gath. Goliath was not an isolated genetic fluke. He was a direct descendant of the very giants the spies had feared 400 years earlier. The biblical record goes on to document Goliath's brother, Lami, along with an unnamed warrior with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, all linked to the same giant lineages and all systematically eliminated by David and his elite warriors. When you look at the geography, a striking theological agenda emerges. Scholar Dr. Michael Heiser argued that the conquest of Canaan was not merely a political or territorial war. It was a targeted campaign to eliminate the last remaining strongholds of the corrupted pre-flood lineages. Every battle fought by Moses, Joshua, and the early judges against the Rephaim, the Emim, and the Anakim was part of a single, continuous effort to cleanse the land of this anomaly. This brings us to a stunning connection regarding what happened to these beings after their physical deaths. The Book of Enoch claims that because the Nephilim were hybrid entities, neither purely spiritual nor purely physical, their spirits could not return to the divine realm upon death. Instead, their disembodied spirits remained bound to the earth, becoming what the ancient world recognized as evil spirits or demons, operating through influence rather than direct physical form. The New Testament writers appear to be well aware of this specific tradition. In the letter of Jude, the author notes that the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness. Similarly, 2 Peter 2:4 states that God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them into Tartarus, the deepest, darkest abyss of confinement. Peter uses the specific Greek verb tartarosis, a term unique to this single verse in the entire New Testament, drawing directly from the exact theological vocabulary preserved in the Book of Enoch. The existence of these unusual populations in ancient Canaan is woven tightly into the historical framework of Judaism and Christianity. They are documented across Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Samuel, and Chronicles. While the exact supernatural mechanics of their origin will always remain a point of deep theological debate, the overarching trajectory of the biblical narrative is clear. Something occurred in the ancient world that fractured the boundaries of creation. That corruption manifested physically on the earth, casting a long shadow that stretched across the flood and into the era of the Israelite kingdoms. The campaign to remove them took generations, moving through Moses, passing to Joshua, and finally falling to a shepherd boy from Bethlehem who stepped into a valley with a sling and finished what had been left incomplete. Goliath was not just a military obstacle. According to the internal logic of the ancient world, he was the final chapter of an ancient rebellion, and the single sentence Genesis gave it at the very beginning turned out to be the opening of a thread that the rest of the Bible spent 1,000 years quietly pulling.